The topic is very big. It is a review of Lebanon's elections results and Iran's post-election results and projection to the future. But let me say in the beginning that these two crises, elections, are really part of a much wider picture, which I hope that this forum now and in the future will discuss further, which is the U.S. general direction in the region and the response of civil societies in the region. That's how I see it. And the example of Lebanon, the example of Iran are the most salient examples. I would draw the attention of our colleagues here that there was another election that we need to look at, municipal election in Morocco, where the expectation was here in Washington and there in Brussels that the Islamists are going to carry it, going to win. And surprise, they didn't. They were defeated. So in 3 places in the greater Middle East, in large segment of the Muslim world, after the Cairo speech, where the outreach was to basically to the Islamists, because they were projected by many advisors here in Washington and there in Brussels that they are going to be the representatives we are going to be sitting down with and talking with. Well, that's not what the civil societies in the region have on their minds. And I'm going to be addressing 2 of these cases quickly. With regard to Lebanon, I'll begin with Lebanon because it's over and there were no massive crisis as a result of the count of the votes. There will be a different kind of crisis later on, and then I will expand on Iran, which is still an ongoing issue today. To understand the elections in Lebanon, I have to go back quickly in 1 minute to the background, how these elections basically confirmed a trend that began in 2005, a trend that many in the West did not want to believe was happening. That is the rise of democracy movements inside Lebanese society across the communities. Obviously, it had the historical democracy movement among the Christians who've resisted from the time of the PLO and Hezbollah, but it has expanded into the Druze community, into the Sunni community, and somewhat into some segments of the Shia community. In 2005, we all remember that the Cedars Revolution put 1.5 million people on the streets of Beirut. That was huge because the population of Lebanon is 3.8 million people. It brought about a majority in parliament during the elections during the spring of 2005. The coalition was then called March 14. That's the one we hear about. March 14 is the day when the Cedars Revolution took the streets. But let's always keep in mind that the March 14 coalition is made of politicians. And the politicians are put in the parliament by votes that do not always represent accurately what the voters, what the demonstrators of the Cedars Revolution wanted. And I'm making this point because we may see the same taking place in Iran. In those very difficult times of transition between dictatorship and we won't know till it happened what, at the end of the day, politicians may well be chosen by voters to represent them in the confrontation against worse dangers, Syrian Hezbollah, danger in Lebanon, and the Khomeinist regime danger in Iran. They do not have necessarily the ability to represent the deep feelings of either voters or demonstrators. So the majority took place in Lebanon in 2005. And that majority was backed by an important UN resolution 1559, which was put together by the Bush administration and the French government at the time. Long story, but it just happened, an alignment of planets that created the conditions for resolution 1559, which asked for withdrawal of the Syrians and the disbanding of militias, of course, including Hezbollah, disarming of Hezbollah. So it was all set for this majority in parliament and the government they have formed in 2005 to proceed with the implementation of resolution 1559. Unfortunately, 2 things happened. One is the failure of that government of the Cedars Revolution, to be very objective, in conducting the disarming of Hezbollah and actually calling for the United Nations and the US and France when the planets were aligned at the time. They failed, and there's a whole analysis of why they failed. The second reason, to be fair here, is that Hezbollah, which was not disarmed after the withdrawal of the Syrians, obviously, which was part of the Syrian withdrawal plan, that's to keep a second army inside Lebanon, proceeded with an offensive. And we wrote about it, spoke about it, talked about it for 4 years now. And the offensive was very clear. Hezbollah was terrorizing, intimidating, creating urban disturbances in Lebanon between July of 2005 and May 7th of 2008, where they were able to change the balance of power in Lebanon and almost control now the country. It began with assassinations of members of parliament, if you recall, in between the summer of 2005 and December of 2005. A number of legislators were killed, including one good friend of mine. Then they outmaneuvered the other factions of March 14 by inviting them to a table of negotiations for 6 months, while in fact they were preparing the July 2006 war. And that July 2006 war wasted another 6 months of the program that the Cedars Revolution was supposed to implement, till Hezbollah was strong enough because of that war to deploy inside the capital, create those urban disturbances, paralyzing actually the government of Mr. Senora. Till technically Hezbollah was ready to launch its offensive, which it did on May 6, 7, and 8 of last year, of 2008, seizing the capital and forcing a change of government. The Qatari, the new friends of Iran, helped in moderating, quote unquote, a conference in Doha last year, forcing almost the Cedars Revolution to, or the March 14 coalition to accept making concessions. So let's put it that way. By this year, before elections, by May of 2009, the March 14 forces were projected, believed to be defeated in the elections, killing MPs, deploying on the ground, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the Iranian regime, the Hezbollah militia controlling practically still 50 to 55% of Lebanon's territories. That alone, we don't need to be political scientists to figure out they're going to win any election. In addition to that, may I point out importantly here, is that as of the fall of 2007, March 14 Cedars Revolution have sort of lost the backing of Washington. And yes, people may be surprised because 2007 was still the Bush administration, but there were a certain change in policy even under the Bush administration with a change of majority in this building, which basically was done in terms of implementing the report, the Baker-Hamilton report. So for the Lebanon battlefield, if you wish, in difference with Iraq and Afghanistan, the concession was already done, because the majority in Congress then wouldn't have ever supported any Bush administration action in support of the Cedars Revolution. So it was already lost. The case was lost from 2007. And that invigorated Hezbollah and their allies, and they were ready all the way to do their coup of May 6, 2008, and then in the election just harvest the results. Now, surprise, because the Cedars Revolution, politicians were not very successful, but the voters were very successful. And the results basically is that the Cedars Revolution, or March 14, got a majority in elections that many in Washington, including many advisors to the administration, and of course Brussels and European Union, have projected that that's it, khalas, Hezbollah is going to be part of the government. They were all bracing and ready to engage with Hezbollah. Actually, the British were tasked to begin that distinction between the political wing of Hezbollah and the non-political wing of Hezbollah. Surprised because the voters in Lebanon, and that's important to understand for Lebanon and Iran, the way civil society reacts and uses democracy is sending strong messages that we need to be very attentive to. Just to go over a couple of details, the voters brought a strong majority for March 14 in the north, in the center of the Bekaa, and in Beirut. That was the game changer. So they got 72 seats out of 128 seats, so they have a comfortable majority now. But warning, this is a very precarious victory. It's an orphan victory in the sense that it has happened, and it is happening in the context of no international backing to hope for. That's my first assessment. Meaning, yes, they withheld the lines. They have it for 4 years. But there is nothing between Europe and the United States and the rest of the international community that promises anything beyond what was there before since the fall of 2007. Now, hint, that means short of a change of direction in Washington and hopefully in Brussels, I do not see that the Cedars Revolution's majority in the Lebanese parliament will do more than what it was able to do in the previous 4 years. So it's a status quo that they were able to hold now and to reconsolidate, but it is a status quo which will depend mostly on what lawmakers here and people in the administration in Washington will have in mind for Lebanon for the future. So that pretty much is where the situation is. It's much better to have this status quo, consolidated status quo, than of course to have a Hezbollah-controlled government, because projections would have been cataclysmic for us, for Israel, for the Arab moderates, for everybody, to have actually Iran sitting on the east coast of the Mediterranean. I mean, no doubt about it. This takes me to Iran. 1 minute about the background of these elections, and then I will expand on the projections. Ahmadinejad's, quote, junta regime came in 2005 as a result of an encouragement by the Khamenei elite that wanted to end the Mohammad Khatami experiment of reform, which was not really a reform. It was a good cop, better than a bad cop at the time. Certain elements within the Khatami group basically wanted to move forward little by little in economic reforms, slightly political, but mostly economic, reminding us probably of the early stage of a Gorbachev regime in the Soviet Union. It began politically, perestroika, and then it moved into glasnost at the time, political. But the elite, the mullah elite, hit hard in 2005 and brought in Ahmadinejad. Since that time, those who were marginalized, we call them, mainstream calls them, the reformists. That would be Rafsanjani, Khatami, Karoubi, and of course, Mir Hussein Mousawi. Now, they chose Mir Hussein Mousawi for a variety of reasons. It has to do with his position in the past as former prime minister, with his links. But the real power behind Mousawi is really Khatami and Rafsanjani. So when Khamenei and Ahmadinejad fight Mousawi, they are fighting, the other part of the regime. So put it that way, one wing of the regime, the so-called reformists, have been waiting for these elections to flex muscle. I am not sure if they're projecting a victory. Now, that's an analytical, parameter that we have to keep in mind for the future, for future analysis. What they wanted to show was that they have a lot of votes. Now, some among them may have dreamt of a victory, but they know it. We who observe Iran know it. It was impossible to project out of these elections, under the control and auspices of Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, that anybody else than Ahmadinejad would win. Now, what was the game, in my sense? The game was that the Khamenei regime wanted to have a less tight, less regular election. Now, that's a nuance that Iranian dissidents are sharing with us now, and it's easy to see if one would follow thoroughly. Why was it that in 2004 there were irregularities? They were fraud, but it didn't score any blip on any radar. Because at the time, the regime wanted to make sure there would be a swift victory for Ahmadinejad, no question asked. So there were no major panels of debate. There were no, sensational, televised reporting about it. This time, for a reason that I will try to explain, Khamenei's elite and strategic communication engineers said, well, let's give it some Hollywoodian dimension. Meaning, let's have the Iranians looking at screens, seeing an American kind of, French kind of presidential debate. But at the end of the day, we control the Ministry of Interior. Pasdaran controls the ballot boxes. Of course, this is no joke. And we will produce Ahmadinejad. There were several reasons for why the regime risked to make it into Hollywoodian, sensational election. And they risked a little bit too far, and the genie is out of the bottle. The first reason is that, and that's important, that civil society in Iran in 2009 is different than civil society of Iran in 2004 and in 1999. Because meanwhile, what has changed was the rise of two democracies, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. Now, you've got to be in the collective psychology of the Iranian youth to understand it. It was a major pressure coming from Iran to see elections being held several times, limping, not perfect, but real elections with multiple parties, including many Shia parties. The Iranians were looking, the Iranians, mostly Shia, were looking at the Shia of Iraq being able to conduct real elections while they were not able to do so. So that created a lot of frustration, which was visible to the regime because it was talked about in chat rooms, on the net, and even in media inside Iran. So that was one pressure. Then came the other pressure from Afghanistan. The Taliban were down since 2001. There were multiple elections. And there was an increasing role for women in municipal, legislative elections, and of course participation in government. So it is a fact that the rise of two, even non-perfect democracies to the east and to the west of Iran created a tremendous psychological pressure on the regime because society was talking about it and wanted to emulate it. That's number one. Number two, something that was not spoken about recently, but most evidently will be addressed soon because I expect it to develop, the ethnic minorities in Iran. If you recall and go back to a lot of the media reporting about the incidents happening in Iran since probably 2003, 2004, and increasingly since 2005, 32% of the ethnic population of Iran are non-Persian, made of minorities. Give you a quick count. To
35, did you say?
What did I say? No, 32%.
32.
Some say 30 more. I would be conservative on that, say 32. In the 20%-ish, the Azeri Turkish-speaking population, which is very calm usually in part of the mainstream in Iran, they inhabit the northwestern part of Iran. They are Turkish-speaking population. Recently, they have been engaged in tensions with the regime on cultural grounds and other grounds. Then you have the Kurdish enclave, which is the other side of Kurdish Iraq. Another 3 to 4, up to 7 million Iranians are Kurdish. And then if you follow that band, if you wish, all the way to the Gulf, there is an Arab ethnic population in Al-Ahwaz province of 3 to 4 million people. That's as many Palestinians, from Jordan to Gaza. It's a large population. That population sits on 80% of Iranian gas and oil. Now, you do your math, what that means. Any move by these minorities will be cataclysmic for the Iranian regime, for the power of the Iranian regime. Add to it most recently, and that's easy to go back and Google it, there were incidents on the other side of Iran's southern belt, if you wish, which are the Baluch. The Baluch begins in Pakistan, and they also, encroach into Iran. There were actually incidents there were explosions last week, the week before, in a couple mosques in that part of Iran. So you have a belt of 32% of minorities who are technically, practically, emotionally, and politically in a state of uprising against the regime. Now, inside the mostly mainstream Persian ethnic majority, you have women's movements, students' movement in an uprising since 1999, cab drivers, bus drivers, artists, and add to it, to the left of the regime, the labor unions. The labor unions have been rising against Ahmadinejad, hating Ahmadinejad because of his mismanagement of their issues. So add up all of that, you have a real majority, a popular majority in Iran, which is not just frustrated with the regime, but waiting for a window of opportunity to move against the mullah. The window of opportunity came. And because of a perception by the regime that things are going better for them internationally, they decided to risk a little bit more. How come I have this analysis? Because since 2007, Grand Ayatollah Khamenei issued a statement in which he said, well, we are out of danger. Remember that statement? Because a majority has changed here. That's how he read it, because of the Baker-Hamilton report. Meaning, there will not be any US action against us. That's how he read it. Since there won't be any action against us, we will continue with our action till at some point we reach a deal with Washington. If you reach a deal with Washington, their psychology is to reach something like Yalta, in a sense that, okay, you have your interests, we have our interests, and then we reach an agreement, but that Yalta is going to be a moving Yalta, in a sense. It's not a rigid one. We will keep moving as much in the region till we solidify our acquisitions, and then the US will have to cut deal with us. Without stretching too much on this issue, let me mention here that with the election of the new administration here, new president, and the commitment by the administration here that there will be a strategic decision to engage the Iranian regime. Now, the Iranian regime, that's Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, this policy was consolidated in statements and other than statements, and the fact that the US president started to call Iran the Islamic Republic of Iran. All of these are important signals and signs. What that left in the mind of the ruling regime is that we're making progress, and by the end of this year, in 2009, there will have to be two things. One is that the international community is going to be checking on the nuclear program of Iran, which brings us to a different dimension, which I will not discuss here, but just mention. So there is a deadline coming, quick. And on the other hand, there will be the beginning of negotiations, sit down with the Iranian regime. Now, the production that Khamenei and his guys wanted to put is a re-election of an Ahmadinejad with a very high margin of votes. That explains why they did not, cook it very quickly. They wanted to show that this is a democracy, and these are panels like you have them in the West, like in France and the United States, but nevertheless, Ahmadinejad got his, 62, 72%, which is not the 99% of Assad, which is ridiculous by our measurement, and it's not a 51% or 50% Palm Beach elections that you had in America. So that's how they fell. So the idea was to show a Ahmadinejad produced by a real democracy. Why? Because the slogan that I anticipated, which may still come, but now I think it's bleeding, is democracies do not disarm other democracies. That's what they want to apply. Because if we are going to them to tell them, surrender your weapons, what is our argument? You are a dictatorship. You are very dangerous. And therefore, we go and ask you to surrender your weapons or reform. Why don't we go to France or to Israel or to any, China is an exception, obviously, and ask them, because these are democracies that are reasonable. So Iran wanted to move, to do some sort of strategic communication. Well, I'm another democracy, and I'm going to have my nuclear capabilities. Surprise, things went otherwise.
Can we wrap up, because I do want to give some time for questions.
Absolutely. And the surprise is this, that the coalition that was formed in those elections is a much wider coalition than the regime expected. You have the reformists of Mousavi on the one hand, but then all the older reformists, older meaning previously having opposed the regime, which includes the youth, women, minorities, have also moved with Mousavi. That explains not the results of the votes, but that explains the 1 million up to 2 million demonstration strength inside Tehran. And to conclude here, in projecting, Khamenei today made a choice this morning. And that choice is Ahmadinejad. And that choice is that he's not going to do the elections again, of course. And that choice is that he has asked the Iranians to go back home and to accept the result, and that he will punish, with the Pasdaran, any action against the government. Now, what do I expect? It all depends on Mousavi and his people, because if Mousavi knows who in the Pasdaran and the armed forces and the apparatus of government will not side with Ahmadinejad and the repression, it's their own measurement, we don't know. If he feels strong enough, put it that way, plus the 1 to 2 million people who will continue to demonstrate, he will continue. Now, what I've heard before I come here is that he ordered or he called for another demonstration on Saturday, I guess, which is a very important trend to let us know that the issue is not over, and it's going to go into escalation, and it's going to be for a long period of time. Good?
Wonderful. Longer than we probably should have had, but very valuable. So thank you. I wanted you to keep going, because I think this is so momentous and so important. Can I just ask quickly one question? Are we to interpret, as some seem to want us to do, the positive developments that you've described as the result of President Obama's Cairo speech?
Well, the answer came from the floor, but actually it's in spite of. And if I have the help of some political psychologists, they would tell me maybe that speech, because it showed the dissidents and the reformists how far the US policy is going to go in cutting deals with the regimes, they said, we don't have any other option. We're going to defend ourselves by doing these elections and winning in these. Actually, it's the other way around.
Great, good.